So this video is going to be my attempt to explain a little bit about the crowding out effect. To understand the crowding out effect, we have to talk about a graph that we haven't seen yet, I don't think. I think I may have talked about it once before we went on hiatus from the classroom, but it's the loanable funds market. So way up here, I don't know if you could read that, loanable funds market. The idea here is this demand curve is the demand, people who need to borrow money, businessmen and sometimes even consumers, but usually businessmen who need to borrow money at high rates of interest. They don't want to borrow very much money. Their projects won't return that high of a rate of return, so they don't borrow much. At low rates, they want to borrow a lot. The supply of loanable funds are the people who have the money. So all the folks, their savings, the wealthy investors, the guys who have lots of money that they are willing to assist entrepreneurs with. At low rates, they don't want to loan much of that out. They'd rather keep their money in other forms, in cash or in stocks and bonds. At higher rates of interest, they're willing to take their money out of those other investments and loan it to businessmen. So high rates of interest, a lot of people are willing, the supply of loanable funds is available. What happens when the government decides it needs to borrow more money? And that's what's going to be happening in the near future here. How are we going to cover the $2 trillion of this package? The government is going to have to borrow that money. So there are going to be a lot of people, the government's going to be selling a lot of bonds. Wealthy people are going to be loaning the government, buying those bonds. And so those wealthy folks that would have been supplying their money for this are now going to be supplying their money to the federal government. In a sense, what actually happens here is this demand for loanable funds shifts to the right. So now it's the demand for loanable funds that is not only private investors' demand for loanable funds, but also the government of the United States' demand for those loanable funds. And of course, it drives the interest rate up. So the original interest rate was down here. We'll call it I1. The new interest rate is significantly higher at I2. All right. Drop my pen. So that drives interest rates up. Well, what happens over here in the investment demand graph? Remember that one? The investment demand graph. If interest rates are higher than they were before, this was the equilibrium amount of investment spending prior to all this, and that's spending by private businessmen. This is the equilibrium amount of spending by private businessmen after the government steps in and borrows a couple of $1 trillion to fund all of this. So this is the classical crowding out effect. The government is trying, let's come down to this graph now. We're in recession. You can see that we're way to the right of full employment. We've got a lot of unemployment going on down here. That's a negative GDP gap is what we call that, if you recall. And it means a lot of unemployment. We're trying to shift AD back to the right. So the government is trying very hard to get this to shift back. So it's going to, again, meet at the new AD curve at full employment. But some businessmen are not spending that money that they would have spent because they can't borrow it now. So this AD curve doesn't shift as far to the right as you think it would. I'm going to actually use red and show you that the AD curve only shifts about that far back to the right. We'll call that AD double prime. And that's a result of the crowding out effect. Now, some economists think the crowding out effect is fairly minor. And the way I've drawn it is relatively minor. We don't shift back as far as some economists think we will. Some economists think the crowding out effect is almost complete and that the AD curve isn't going to go anywhere. All the money that government spends means money that businessmen aren't spending. So we get a multiplier effect on the government spending, a positive multiplier effect, but then we get a negative multiplier effect on the money that businessmen are not spending, and the AD curve just stays stuck right there. History and more mainstream economics say that there is a crowding out effect, but it's not complete. In fact, AD will shift to the right, not by as much as we would want it to, but it will shift to the right. So that's the crowding out effect. And we're going to talk about crowding out a lot in coming chapters as we move on toward the end of the semester. So that's the video on crowding out.